Hey everyone, welcome back to Conservation in Action, and welcome to the third lecture of the intro series, Threats to Wildlife. So, we already did this class in person, but this is just a recap of everything that we talked about in class to anybody who missed it or anybody who's following along with the class outside of enrollment. So, moving on, just to summarize a little bit of lecture two, we were talking about understanding ecosystems and biodiversity and how it's essential to create actionable change. We talked about how ecosystems are interconnected systems with emergent properties, and their resilience depends on multiple factors, including the presence of keystone species. And we also talked about how biodiversity not encompasses not only species richness but also functional and genetic diversity. And we kind of talked about the differences, how we should prioritize each, and we talked a lot about like different debates in conservation in terms of ethical or moral dilemmas, or prioritization dilemmas when it comes to policy. We talked a lot about that in our small group sessions. So, the central question for today was, what are the most significant threats to wildlife today? And what about in the Bay? So, next we watched a video by the World Wildlife Fund, which is not popping up on the screen right now, but if you want to watch it, there's a link in B courses. Otherwise, it's World Wildlife Fund. I believe it's called What Earth is. Yeah, I don't remember the title right now, but it's a really good video, and if you want to watch it, feel free. It's on YouTube, and also B courses. So to summarize some of the key points in that video that we had watched in class, they talked about main threats to biodiversity, and these five that they mentioned were changes in land and sea use, invasive species, overexploitation, climate change, and poaching slash illegal wildlife trade. These were a lot of the main threats that were discussed during the video, and it was a very good summary of all the threats that are kind of facing wildlife globally. But to make it a bit more specific, I facilitated this lightning game called What Would I Do? And basically, I presented a scenario and gave you a problem in conservation and asked you to try and solve it. What would you do to solve this conservation issue? So I'm just going to read out some of these scenarios and then you can read the rest on your own. This first one was an invasive species, such as an aggressive non native plant or animal, has started to overtake a protected national park, threatening native species and disrupting the ecosystem. You have a limited budget and a small team, but the ecosystem's survival is at stake. How would you approach managing this invasive species problem? And then I put a little few things to note on the bottom: ethical considerations and management strategies. So when we talked about this in class, we had a lot of different ideas, and it was a really productive conversation about what strategies do work, what strategies can't work. We talked a lot about real life examples of some things, such as management in the Channel Islands, where they had a overwhelming population of invasive pigs, and they took the measure to shoot those pigs, and for the survival of, or for the benefit of the native species on the island, because there was no other way to remove them that would have been as effective. And so they hired a team from New Zealand who specializes in this kind of thing for removing pigs off of islands. And it was a really interesting example to kind of play around with different management strategies of removing an invasive species that might be taking over a certain ecosystem. So, yeah, there's pros and cons to everything. A lot of people had a lot to say about that kind of removal strategy, and others said that's the only way to do it. So, yeah, super interesting topic to kind of think about when talking about conservation. So, scenario two was that urban development is rapidly expanding, leading to habitat fragmentation that threatens local wildlife species like deer, foxes, and birds. You've been appointed to create a wildlife corridor to help animals safely cross between fragmented habitats. What would your first steps in designing and implementing this corridor be? Some things to note that I mentioned was safety and cooperation of the local community. For this scenario, we talked a lot about how different states have been implementing different types of wildlife corridors. And if you don't know what a wildlife corridor is, I basically explained that it is a way that humans can facilitate animal movement between fragmented habitats in a safe way. Like, for example, some wildlife corridors could be like wildlife, like highways that go over or under a human highway, and animals can go through to different habitats that way instead of crossing the street. There's also many different examples that we kind of chatted about in class, and it contributed to what our ideas were for this scenario. And scenario three, we talked about sustainable fishing practices and how these overfishing problems can be addressed through different management strategies. In this scenario, we were talking about working in a region where illegal wildlife trade has been rampant. And I think it was a good lens for kind of a global sphere, to reduce human wildlife conflict and aggression towards humans encroaching on natural habitat, and that those ecosystems or biodiversity kind of fighting back against that clash. So it was a productive conversation about how these things have pros and cons. Like, every single management strategy has a pro and a con, and some people have different opinions on it than others. So really fascinating conversation. In class, we didn't really have time to go over scenario 5 that much, but to kind of note, we were going to talk about a large forest reserve home to endangered species like orangutans and tigers, and it was being cleared for agricultural expansion. So I was going to ask, if you have a limited resources, or if you have limited resources, time, money, management, what can you do to raise awareness about the issue? And I think a lot of people had really good ideas in their weekly reflection that I read. So this one was a really interesting one to think about too. So, to kind of summarize some of the main conservation strategies that we were discussing as we were debating some of these scenarios, we talked about ecotourism, we talked about wildlife corridors, technological solutions like drones and stuff like that. We also talked about biodegradable products, habitat restoration and rehabilitation programs, and legal action. Legal action is a big one that a lot of people think about immediately when thinking about management and policy. They kind of go hand in hand. So, definitely a really cool solution that we discuss a lot. Here was our second World Wildlife Fund video. So this one was titled How We Can Reverse Wildlife Biodiversity Loss. And it's a good video, just very summarized, very generalized summary of kind of some solutions. So to discuss some of these solutions, we discussed their points of halting species loss, conserving habitats, tackling the direct drivers of nature loss, rethinking finance, and working with and for the people. I think the one that I was the most fascinated by was this rethinking finance idea. And the video kind of has a very interesting outlook on rethinking finance. And I think if you do want to watch a video about a very generalized video, but I think it is conceptually very interesting to think about how we can rethink finance in a way that is going to be ecologically and economically both beneficial. So, we talked a lot about threats throughout the whole lecture, and at the end of this kind of class, it's good to talk about some optimism because, at least for me, it is super, super, super important to think about some things that are like good in the world after all of that negativity. And yes, there's a lot threatening biodiversity right now, but there is a growing global movement to protect our biodiversity. I mean, 20 years ago, this class may have had much less people in it, and also very different opinions. And like every time period has a different outlook on conservation, and I think right now we're in a period of time where there is cause for optimism because the younger generation and a lot of the majority of the population around the world really cares about biodiversity, and we have the opportunity to tap into that. This QR code is some 2024 conservation wins. If you want to be kind of uplifted a little bit in an article, that's a good one to read. So I just wanted to talk about some success stories to kind of build off of that optimism idea. There's lots of cause to be optimistic. I mean, one of them is the California gray wolf's comeback. I mean, they were absent from California for nearly 100 years, and in 2011, a wolf named OR7, super creative now, I know, crossed the Oregon-California border. And since then, more wolves have entered California, and the state has set up protections to help establish a sustainable population, including the California Wolf Project, which is a combination of efforts between UC Berkeley and California Fish and Wildlife. And I'm actually working on that project right now as an undergraduate researcher. So if you have any like questions or want to know how to get involved, let me know. You can always send me an email, comment on bee courses. I am totally willing to yap about the California gray wolf. I'm super interested in their research and recovery, so send any questions you have my way. Another success story I wanted to mention was the sea otter recovery, because they were also once reduced to near extinction, this time by hunting. It's rebounded across the waters of the California coast, and there are a lot of challenges that remain, but the population has increased to a little over 3,000 individuals, I believe. So it's a really amazing story of recovery, again, in California. Another example from California is the sea lions and elephant seals. After centuries of overhunting, California sea lions and elephant seals have made a significant population recovery, and now their populations are pretty strong along the California coast, and they're protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is definitely a really cool solution to conservation, which we were kind of talking about before with that legal action point. And just a super exciting and beautiful success story that we actually are going to be able to see in person once we go on our field trip to Point Reyes. So that's going to be really cool. And another success story is the California tiger salamander. So these guys are super, super cute, but on top of that, they were once very threatened and were listed under the Endangered Species Act, and has since benefited from a lot of habitat restoration programs. A lot of efforts have been focusing on vernal pools, which are breeding grounds for salamanders, and are protecting them from urban development. And the last success story is the California condor. So actually, next lecture, we're going to have a presentation by Alicia Powers, who is the head zookeeper of the California Trail section at Oakland Zoo. And she's actually going to be talking about this California condor recovery because Oakland Zoo has had a lot of involvement in this recovery story. So I do want to give the mic to her a little more, but some summary to this story was that the condor population dropped to around 27 individuals in the 80s, and through extensive captive breeding programs and reintroduction strategies, the population has grown to over 400 birds. And so they're still very endangered, but there is much cause for happiness and success to know that this population has rebounded from just so few individuals. And to conclude class, I just wanted to mention that the main threats to biodiversity we mentioned were changes in land and sea use, overexploitation, climate change, invasive species, and poaching/wildlife trade. We also covered the What Would I Do game, and that game was to kind of get us started on thinking about how us as conservationists or future conservationists will tackle certain problems and what could arise with every single one. So yeah, it's super interesting. Then I wanted to remind everyone that there is a weekly reflection due at 5 p.m. right before the next class. And we also have a field trip sign up. That QR code is for the field trip if you are signing up within the February range of 2025. That is still open. And Dr. Gladys is going to be joining me for an interview and a presentation about her work. She is the first wildlife vet in Uganda, and she wrote a book recently whose foreword was actually written by Jane Goodall. And I actually have it right here. But it's just an amazing book, and I recommend it to anyone who wants to have a uplifting story about how her story was kind of a like overcome she overcame a lot of stuff, and it's really interesting to read about how she's been so successful. And if you have any questions for her, you can also fill out a different Google form in B courses to let me know what kind of questions to ask her. So, yeah. Now we're just going to preview the next lecture. We're going to have Alicia Powers come in. She's the head zookeeper at Oakland Zoo, California Trail Section, like I mentioned before. And she's going to speak on conservation success stories, how she became a zookeeper, and how the Oakland Zoo in particular is super involved in conservation, kind of the history of zoos, and why modern zoos are essential key points of conservation today. And this was the participation form. It's no longer active, but the animal of the week was a mountain lion. Thank you guys so much for listening.